Hi, I'm Jay Link, President of Stewardship Ministries. Many of you have likely attended a conference where someone gets up at the beginning of the conference to go over important housekeeping matters that you need to know. Housekeeping matters are often important minor details that will help the conference run more smoothly, like hotel checkout time, restroom locations, scheduled break times, airport shuttle departures, and so on. However, I would like to suggest an alternative understanding of the phrase that being, it matters how we keep our house. In other words, housekeeping really matters. The house I am suggesting that we need to be keeping is not the one made of wood and bricks that contains our stuff, but it is the one made of flesh and blood that houses us and the Holy Spirit. Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 3:16, "Do you not know that you are God's temple and that God's Spirit dwells in you?" Notice our body is God's temple, and as such we need to treat it as a mutual dwelling place. There are three important reasons why it really does matter how well we are keeping our house. First, housekeeping matters because it is commanded. I often hear people make offhanded comments suggesting that God isn't at all that concerned about how we eat or how well we take care of our bodies because after all, we're going to get a new perfect one later. They will often quote Romans 14:14, where Paul assesses food in general, says, "I know and am persuaded in the Lord that Jesus, that nothing is unclean in of itself." They conclude that anything that can be chewed up and swallowed is acceptable fare for food. And God really doesn't care what we consume. Regarding exercise, I frequently hear mentioned 1 Timothy 4:8, where Paul says, "For bodily discipline is only of little profit, but godliness is profitable for all things." They conclude that because spiritual exercise is of greater value than physical exercise is unimportant. But as caretakers of bodies that do not belong to us, I would like to suggest that we consider a broader perspective on the feeding and exercise of the bodies that God has entrusted to us. Most believers are quite familiar with 1 Peter 1:15 and 16, which says, "But as He who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, 'You shall be holy, for I am holy.'" Few realize that this is actually a quote from the Old Testament, and it may surprise you to know the context where the phrase, "Be holy, for I am holy," comes from. In Leviticus chapter 11, verses 44 and 45, God gives dietary directions to the children of Israel. "For I am the Lord your God, consecrate yourself therefore, and be holy, for I am holy. You shall not defile yourself with any swarming thing that crawls on the ground, for I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." This concept of being holy, for I am holy, comes right out of the middle of a chapter where God is telling His children what to eat and not to eat. Keep in mind the word holy also means pure. Apparently God does not want His children to defile the houses He has given them by consuming things that will physically defile, pollute, or abuse those physical houses. We must understand that how we feed our house is not a means to spiritual approval. Paul points this out in 1 Corinthians 8:8. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off spiritually if we do not eat, no better off spiritually if we do. How we keep our house will have no effect on us after we leave this life. However, it can and will have a massive and often long-term effect on us while we are still in this life. In spite of his command, Paul still understands the need for strict physical discipline and the tragic spiritual ramifications for failing to maintain such discipline. In 1 Corinthians 9:27, he says, "But I discipline my body and make it my slave so that after I have preached to others, I myself might not be disqualified." What we eat and drink and how much we eat and drink has continually been an important physical issue with considerable spiritual ramifications for many centuries. It was as far back as the 4th century when the church first listed gluttony as one of the 7 deadly or cardinal sins. Physical housekeeping really does matter. Second, housekeeping matters because it is worship. Paul gives us a second perspective on the extent that housekeeping matters when he challenges us in Romans 12:1. Therefore, I urge you, brethren, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as living and holy sacrifices acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. Paul makes the same point in answering his own rhetorical question in 1 Corinthians 6:19 and 20. Do you not know that your body is the temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own, for you have been bought with a price? Therefore, glorify God in your body. We are to be glorifying God with and in our bodies. In both these passages, Paul connects our physical and our spiritual lives together. He tells us how well we keep our house should glorify Him and be an outward physical expression of our worship of Him. Is how you keep your body an act of worship for you? Does the current condition of your house bring Him glory? Is your housekeeping a clear demonstration of your loving and careful management of the dwelling place He has entrusted to you? Physical housekeeping really does matter. Third, housekeeping matters because it's smart. Even if God hadn't commanded us to take good care of our houses, and even if He hadn't told us that we worship Him by what we do with our bodies, there is still a third entirely pragmatic reason to take good care of our bodies that should by itself be a compelling enough reason to be responsible housekeepers. It has been my observation over the years that any asset left unmanaged becomes a liability. I have found no exceptions to this maxim, whether it be material things, relationships, or businesses. You name it. If you buy a new car, never service the car, your asset will eventually turn into a liability. Likewise, if you do not properly service your body, it will eventually become a liability too, sooner than later. The Center for Disease Control reports on the health of America is staggering. It estimates that of the 300 million Americans, 63% are considered overweight or obese, 80% of Americans over 25 are overweight, and 78% of Americans are not even meeting basic activity levels that are recommended. According to the former U.S. Surgeon General Dr. Everett Koop, of the 2.4 million deaths that occur in the United States each year, 75% are a result of avoidable nutritional factor diseases. In other words, 75% of Americans are suffering and ultimately dying prematurely from self-inflicted degenerative diseases due to the poor care and feeding of their houses. Can you imagine the hundreds of millions of dollars of God's money that God's people are needlessly spending on drugs and surgery and health care to attempt to recover from the physical maladies that they've brought upon themselves by failing to make good long-term lifestyle decisions? God's assets have been turned into a liability. It is just smart to do whatever we possibly can to allow our houses to retain their vigor, their health, and their vitality as long as possible. Because of the curse of Adam, all of our bodies are going to eventually wear out and cease to operate. But doesn't it make sense to postpone that time as long as possible by taking good care of the houses so they remain an asset that God can use for His purposes and His glory? The more healthy we remain, the more useful we can be for God's kingdom and for His purposes. If you knew that the next car you bought was going to be the last car you would ever own, if you knew that it was going to have to last you for decades, and even though there are some replacement parts available, you are going to have to live with whatever condition it was in, would you care for your car differently? I would. How much more should we treat our most valuable physical asset with meticulous care? This is the only body we are going to get this side of glory. If you would like to develop a healthier lifestyle, become a better housekeeper, I would suggest you start with the book Maker's Diet by Jordan Rubin, and then go from there. And don't forget the owner's manual. You would be absolutely amazed at what God has told us in His manual about health, disease, diet, and exercise. I hope as you pray and seek the mind of the Lord on this important but often ignored area of stewardship, that you will come to agree with me that housekeeping really matters.